We now come to motion 7 on the scrutiny of European statutory instruments. I call the Minister to move the motion.
I'd like to move formally.
The question is motion 7 as on the order paper. Jim McAllister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Scrutiny of the laws that we make and that bind us is very important. It is exceedingly important when the origins of the laws are not within our own parliamentary framework. And of course, the part of the United Kingdom from which I come, Northern Ireland, is an area where in over 300 areas of law, the laws are not made by this House, they're not made by the Stormont Assembly, they're made by a foreign parliament that we don't elect, the European Parliament. And therefore, when it comes to scrutiny, that underscores the huge importance of scrutiny being effective. And insofar as this motion moves to slightly improve the situation, that's welcome. But there are three or four points I do need to make about this. Is the inference of this motion that there has been no scrutiny of these matters since the demise of the European Scrutiny Committee in or about April of last year? And if that is so, then obviously there's been a vast swathe of laws which have gone unscrutinised. The former chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee told this House in March 23 that in the 2 years from 21 to 23 there have been 620 EU laws imposed on Northern Ireland. How many have been imposed since? How many of them have been scrutinised? And since Northern Ireland is the region most affected by many of these laws, then I do have to register, Madam Deputy Speaker, disappointment that there isn't a single member from Northern Ireland proposed on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. That seems to me to be a huge failure in respect of giving some confidence to those I represent and the part of the United Kingdom from which I come that scrutiny is taking place and is effective. Third point is one. Yes,
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. As someone who sat on the European Scrutiny Committee in the last Parliament, does the honourable gentleman agree with me that it's no surprise that the now Labour government don't want to scrutinise this legislation coming from the European Union? Because for much of the last Parliament, with the exception of the former member for Dagenham, John Cruddas, the Labour members of the former European Scrutiny Committee literally never turned up.
I hear what the right honourable gentleman says, and I don't gainsay what he says, and if that is so, then it is a very poor reflection on the interest in scrutiny. So not only have we this lacuna where there has been a year or more of no scrutiny in respect of these matters, but we also have the very unsatisfactory position of there being no transparency. There is no public list of all the imposed EU laws. It doesn't exist, from what I'm told. Now, how can it be right that citizens in any part of this United Kingdom can be governed by laws of which there isn't even a list of what all those laws are? So I would be looking to the government for a commitment that going forward there at least will be the transparency of publishing a list of all relevant regulations which are imposed, and that is the correct word, imposed on Northern Ireland from a foreign parliament. Now some might say, Oh, but doesn't the Stormont Assembly have a democratic scrutiny committee? Of sorts it does. But on the 2nd of February this year, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland wrote to the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly informing him of the types of laws that would be reported to the Assembly, and it does not include all laws. We have the Stormont break, so-called. It applies only to any amending law of an existing EU law. We have the applicability motion. It applies to any new law. But we do not have any right of scrutiny within the Northern Ireland Assembly of what we would call statutory instruments. There simply is no capacity to scrutinise it. And we've recently had a quite troubling example of such a statutory instrument. Commission Implementing Regulation 2025-89. For the first time in any part of this United Kingdom, created the situation where, with no consultation with our consumers, with no consultation with our elected representatives, we now have an authorised EU law whereby mealworm and insects can be included in food products. An EU law which has been imposed upon Northern Ireland without any scrutiny in Stormont or in this place. So I do ask this question: is this the type of EU implementing regulation which would be on the agenda of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee? Or would it just pass under the radar, as has been happening for so long? And of course, there is a vast swathe of law which are very important, which, because under the protocol arrangements, they are not what could be classified as devolved issues, which are never scrutinised, nor can ever be scrutinised, within the Northern Ireland Assembly. Anything that arises under the EU's customs code, anything that arises under its VAT regime, anything that arises under state aid, none of those issues are devolved issues. They are reserved issues to this place. There are regulations made from time to time on customs code. And the customs code, of course, is the most offensive of all the protocol arrangements, because it is the one that says Northern Ireland is to be treated as EU territory, GB is to be treated as a third or foreign country, and thus the goods coming from GB to Northern Ireland, coming from a third country, have to be subject to the rigours of an international customs border. All that arises under the EU's customs code, and none of that can be scrutinised in Northern Ireland, and none of it has been being scrutinised in this House either. Yes?
Thank the honourable member for giving way. On the issue of the lack of scrutiny, would he agree with me that as time goes on now and the American administration begin to look at what they may or may not do vis-à-vis the EU in terms of trading arrangements, it's all the more important, it was important anyway, but even more important now that we have close scrutiny because of potential deals that may come about between the American administration, the UK and possibly the EU?
Yes, and there is much, I'm grateful, there is much talk about tariffs. Yes. And think of the conundrum that would be created if President Trump imposed tariffs on the EU. Northern Ireland, treated as EU territory, would, I presume, be subject to those tariffs. Yet we're told we're part of the United Kingdom. And all that because of the application to Northern Ireland of the Customs Code. And if, therefore, there were corresponding responses from the EU to that scenario, under adjustments to or matters arising under its Customs Code, they too, it seems, would apply to Northern Ireland. And all that without scrutiny. So I do think that whereas the establishment of this committee, belated as it is welcome, it is important to understand that it will seriously address the scrutiny issues, as the previous committee under Sir Bill Cash did do, and I pay tribute to the work they did. But there has been this great gap in the meantime of no scrutiny effectively whatsoever. And now under a committee, as I've made the point, without even a Northern Ireland representative upon it. Yes?
Would you accept that even when we had the European Scrutiny Committee, which was able to exclusively deal with these kinds of issues, that there were many, many EU regulations which did not have the opportunity to discuss them, and given the importance of this, not just to Northern Ireland, but as the members pointed out, to the whole of the United Kingdom, that to allow this kind of thing to develop leaves us very, very vulnerable to changes in laws which could be detrimental and which don't actually get enough examination in this House?
Absolutely. The sheer volume of EU law which still applies in Northern Ireland. You have in Annex 2 of the Protocol 287 areas of law, many added to it since. So all of that breeds further regulation of a huge quantity, and yet the lack of scrutiny and the speed with which it is applied and the lack of opportunity for scrutiny is important. And one of the complaints I hear from the European Scrutiny Committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly is that they aren't given the time or notice to deal with issues, even if there were the inclination amongst some to deal with them. Yes,
it's even worse than that. On occasions, the regulations have gone through, been adopted before they even know that the regulation is there.
Yeah, and the Cabinet Office undertakes to notify on a weekly basis, but I think, frankly, that is honoured more in default than in anything else. So we are in a very, from a point of view of scrutiny position, a very perilous position. I do hope this committee will grasp this issue. I do hope they will take it seriously, and my only regret is there isn't a member from Northern Ireland on that committee to hold their feet to the fire on this particular issue. But it does go to the heart of what should affect and concern us all as representatives. And I do say to members of this House who come from other parts of the United Kingdom, how would they feel if 300 areas of law they couldn't make, couldn't change, and the regulations imposed on them weren't even being properly scrutinised? I think we know how others would feel. Well, frankly, we ask for nothing that others don't have for themselves. Thank you.
Leader of the House.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and can I thank the honourable gentleman for those contributions, which I'm sure the House has heard. Can I first of all just explain to members that what is not on the order paper today is anything about the European Scrutiny Committee. We've actually previously dealt with that. This is a specific committee, which is the European Statutory Instruments Committee, and the role was to consider whether certain proposed negative instruments in relation to the UK's withdrawal from the EU should instead follow the affirmative procedure. And what's actually happened in its absence is that all measures have proceeded through the affirmative procedure instead. And in fact, the numbers are quite low. The gentleman asks that question. I think previously this committee looked at about 50 a year, 50 per parliamentary session. But by the final session of the last Parliament, so over that year of the last Parliament, that was down to just 11, and it's been lower since then as well. So we're talking about a very tiny number of instruments being considered as to whether they go through the affirmative or not. I'll give way if it's on that point.
And I think in regards to that, and as my honourable colleague in North Antrim has made the point, if it is such a low number and this committee isn't going to meet so regularly, why not give Northern Ireland a place on it?
So the proposal is that this committee doesn't meet and that these measures are considered by the relevant select committee of the House. So were they to relate to Northern Ireland, then they would be considered by the Northern Ireland Committee in that sense. That's what this motion relates to. It's not the European Scrutiny Committee, which a number of members have mentioned. It did do quite specific work, and that's why we just now don't feel it's value for money for the House to pay for a chair and to facilitate a committee that would need to meet hardly at all to consider a very rare occasion of a statutory instrument, to consider whether or not it should go through the affirmative route, which, as I say, in the absence of it, they've all gone through the affirmative route, and now in the absence of it would be considered by the relevant committee of this House, which I'm sure in many instances will be the Northern Ireland Select Committee. So I hope that reassures members. But what I can also say to members is that I do take these matters extremely seriously. I think it's very important that this House does scrutinise measures, whether they're statutory instruments generated by the government, whether they're pieces of legislation, whether they're the roll-on of other things from the European Union or elsewhere. I take it very seriously, and I'm happy to keep under consideration how best we can consider these matters should the context change. And if members who've spoken today or in the chamber today have got other ideas about that, then please do let me know and we'll happily consider them.
The question is, motion 7 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion number 8, Consumer Protection. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion number 9 on National Health Service. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes